Hello, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Andrew Bernard, and I'm a visiting fellow in the Council's Europe Center. Thank you for joining us as we reflect upon the 50th anniversary of Portugal's Carnation Revolution. On April 25, 1974, a small group of Portuguese military officers, angered at the longevity of the repressive Estado Novo regime and exasperated with the multiple colonial wars of the nation's fading empire, took the initiative to remove that regime. The famous British journalist Bernard Levin commented that the most impressive aspect of the military coup was how, in a matter of hours, an entrenched regime, which endured for nearly half a century, disappeared as if it never existed. The Carnation Revolution set the process in motion for Portugal to eventually become a thriving and resilient democracy, with the country entering the European Economic Community in 1986. But in the months and years immediately following the military coup, there was no certainty that democracy would take root in Portugal. That era was rocked by massive social and economic upheaval, rapid decolonization, and mass immigration from citizens fleeing Portugal's former colonies. Political instability was rampant in the 2 years that followed the April 25th, 1974 revolution. Yet, the country persevered to be the vibrant European nation that it is today. To help us understand Portugal's journey from the Carnation Revolution to today, as well as lessons this chapter of Portuguese history has for the future, the Atlantic Council is honored to have with us former Portuguese Prime Minister José Manuel Durão Barroso. Prime Minister Durão Barroso served as Prime Minister of the Portuguese Republic from 2002 to 2004. He subsequently served 2 consecutive 5-year terms as European Commission President from 2004 to 2014. Today, the former Prime Minister serves as Chairman and Non-Executive Director of Goldman Sachs International and Chair of the Board of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. Joining the Prime Minister in this discussion will be Dr. Lucio Vinas de Souza. A renowned economist, Dr. Vinas de Souza is currently a fellow at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and a visiting professor at Brandeis University. You can follow along with the conversation on X, formerly known as Twitter, at AC Europe. We are looking forward to this fabulous conversation. Without any further ado, I turn the floor over to Prime Minister Durão Barroso and Dr. Vinas de Souza.
Many thanks, Andrew, for the introduction, which completely makes it necessary for me to make any introduction in relation to Prime Minister Durão Barroso. José Manuel, let's dive straight into it. You were someone that had both political activism and activism against the colonial war before the Carnation Revolution, of a left-wing tinge, if I can put it this way. Now, can you perhaps tell us about the environment in these times on the run-up to the Carnation Revolution, and if I can ask, also about your own personal political evolution from the period from the left-wing type of inclinations to the leader of the Social Democratic Party in Portugal. Was this related to the type of environment that we had during the revolution? Please, José Manuel.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucio, and thank you, the Atlantic Council. It's a pleasure to share my opinions on this interesting, fascinating period of Portuguese history. Of course, I'm going to give a personal opinion based on my personal experience. It was 25th of April, 74, so it will be the day after tomorrow, 50 years. And I had just turned, at that time, 18. I was 18 years old. Before the revolution, I was active against the regime, participating in everything that was against the regime, because I wanted freedom for my country, and also because I was against the colonial rule that Portugal was keeping in several parts of the world, namely in Africa, with Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and other territories under Portuguese colonial rule. And can we imagine how important it was for me and for my generation, but to see in a matter of some hours, a regime that had lasted almost 48 years, an extremely conservative, reactionary regime from the right, to crumble after 48 years. It was really a great experience. That's why I became very much involved. I was sometime afterwards elected president of the Students' Association Union of the law school of Lisbon, a very politicized school, and I became really radical. But afterwards, of course, I came back to my, let's say, family or social or cultural ecology, and I became a centrist. When I was 20 years, I had already left these, let's say, adventures of the far left, because at the end of the day, that was an experience. I'm very proud of it, I have to say. Existential politics, physical politics. There was a real, let's say, existential fight in the schools of Lisbon and in the overall. Basically, our party was far left against the communists, the pro-Soviet communists. It's very important to understand that. At that time, in '74, those parties that became afterwards the core of our system, the Socialist Party in the center left, the Social Democrat in the center right, did not yet exist. But it was very interesting for me and for my generation. By the way, the same more or less happened in Spain, sometime later, in Greece, where we had these young people that were very radical, but afterwards became the leaders of the new democratic regimes, including, for instance, a friend of mine was extreme left and became afterwards Secretary General of NATO, Javier Solana in Spain. And the same happened in Greece and other countries in the transition to democracy, what, by the way, a great American scholar called the third wave of democratization. That was, in fact, launched by Portugal, even before Spain, and afterwards it had also very important, let's say, ramifications, including in Latin America. At that time, most countries were right-wing dictatorships, and then we had several cases of transition to democracy.
Many thanks. Allow me to zoom in into one particular point that you mentioned, which was the fact that we did not actually have the sort of ecosystem of political parties that were necessary for the transition. Now, one perhaps key factor in this constitution of this ecosystem was external support. We had an unusually high-profile American ambassador for Portugal, Frank Carlucci, who later became deputy head of the CIA and actually Secretary of Defense of the United States. Incidentally, his daughter just published a memoir in which she mentioned part of the experiences that he had in Portugal. And the Socialist Party itself was actually set up with support of the German Socialist Party as a way to fight the communists, right? So let's reflect a little on this external component of the process that led to the success of the Carnation Revolution.
Well, it was a real major geopolitical change. Let's not forget it was not just about Portugal, it was about the colonies of Portugal. Portugal was fighting, the Portuguese regime was fighting the biggest war at that time in a more extensive territory, in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and it was still the Cold War. So we had the United States on one side, we had Soviet Union, and in Portugal we had a communist party that was 100% aligned with the Soviet Union, okay? And in fact, that's why, for instance, we were fighting against the previous regime, authoritarian, right-wing, but we were also fighting against the communists that in fact tried to overturn democracy and made some kind of let's say, communist or socialist regime, or what they call popular democracy, not what they call bourgeois democracy. And this is very important to understand. So it was, in fact, a major issue that was worrying many people outside Portugal, the Americans, but also our friends in Europe. And it's true, what you said, Frank Carlucci. I met him many years later, so I spoke with him several times, and also with Henry Kissinger, that I remember well. He was a good friend. He died recently. And in fact, according to the best reports, Kissinger thought that Portugal was lost, that the communists were going to win. And Carlucci was one of those who said to the State Department and to Washington, no, it's not lost. We can support democratic forces. And it's true also that Europeans played a role, namely the Germans. There are, in fact, some reports that show it was the first time after the so-called Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt that Germany had a real proactive attitude in European political affairs. not only helping the creation of the Socialist Party just before the revolution in Germany, but also through the different political foundations, the Friedrich Naumann that supported the creation of my party, PSE, but also the Konrad Adenauer that supported the creation of the Christian Democrats and others. They were very important in supporting the transition to democracy in Portugal and the fight against communism. Having said that, and also any possible return to right wing, but in fact, at that time, it was completely impossible. So when the former regime collapsed, no one was defending it. At that time, the real threat became the communists. And in fact, I think it was important, but let me tell you, I don't think it was decided. We have to make a distinction between, in a process like this, what are the internal causes and what are the external conditions. It's true that the action of the United States, of Germany, and most European countries was decisive in the sense of creating the best conditions for Portugal to see its future in the European Union. At that time, we said European Community. And Portugal, to be where Portugal wanted to be. Portugal wanted to be a normal country, like the other European countries. Portugal did not want to be a kind of a Cuba or not even a Yugoslavia in Western Europe. Portugal wanted to be a normal country. And that was, and the wide sentiment of the Portuguese population from the north to the south of the country was in fact for democracy and for pluralism.
Absolutely. The Portuguese have the freedoms that they have because of their own fights and efforts, and the external actors, they were supporters in this process. The revolution, the Verão Quente, introduced a series of distortions in the Portuguese economy that in one way or another had to be worked out in our process of accession towards the European Union. This was something that is very much related to your own professional experience and career. You were, after all, president of the Commission and my boss during a period of my own professional life, let's put it this way. So how do you see this period, let's say, from the moment in which we have the revolution, the introduction of a series of distortions, and the moment in which we enter the Union as a member state, or what is now the European Union?
After the revolution, it is normal that we have this kind of explosion, the idea that everything is possible. So there was a period of radicalization. But in fact, the Portuguese, the huge majority of the Portuguese did not vote for the extremes. They vote for the center left with the socialists and for the center right with the social democrats. And it was clear after 75 where the political will of the majority of the Portuguese were. And those parties were 100% pro-European Union, 100%. And they asked to join the European community. There was an agreement among the most important parties. And in fact, it was very important because this was the line of demarcation, the line of making a difference between the so-called European democratic parties and the Communist Party. Because the Communist Party was, and they still are, against the European Union. So Portugal, before the revolution, was already integrated somehow in the Western Alliance. Portugal was a founding member of NATO, and differently from Spain. And differently from Spain, Portugal was a member of EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, with England, with the UK and others. But as you know, to become a member of the European community, you had to be a democracy. So when democracy happened, naturally, Portugal wanted to join as soon as possible the European community, which eventually happened in 86. At that time, I was already the junior minister in the government of Cavaco Silva.
José Manuel points something that is actually very important, which is there is a component of continuity on the liberalization process that we started under the later stages of Salazarism, entering into the OECD, becoming a member of EFTA, being a founding member of NATO, which in a way continues throughout the revolution. So the changes in the Portuguese society, they preceded the revolution, they continued through it afterwards, right? Which is something that is important for us to understand the dynamics of the process itself.
Yeah, but very much accelerated. And in fact, it was a rupture. The revolution was really a rupture.
Sure.
But it's true that Portugal was somehow already trying to be integrated in the Western order. But at that time, the motive was also against communism, against the Soviet Union. So it's that is important to understand the difference between the Portuguese case and some other cases. Yes.
Indeed, indeed. A particular feature of the Portuguese experience, thinking of this as a continuity, was the type of vulnerabilities that we had already from the time of the revolution. Our process of entry into the European Union led later to a significant amount of convergence, but we had the period of the crisis itself. You were president of the Commission, and perhaps trying to think of how the crisis that we had in the later stages of the transition from democracy to member of the European Union. We had two back-to-back IMF programs, right? So in the late 70s, beginning of the 1980s, what's the relation that we can have perhaps between the vulnerabilities of this period and the crisis that the country faced later?
Yeah, no, yes, as you say, Lucy, very rightly, after the revolution, because of this explosion of demands and hope, there was too excessive demands on the state, and there was, the public expenditure went, to very unsustainable levels. It was, by the way, a chronic problem in Portugal. It was not the first time. Let's not forget that the Portuguese dictatorship was established by Salazar when he was Minister of Finance, and also because he came to put the public accounts in order. Because during the Republic, because we had a Republic from 1910 to, let's say, 1926, there was a military coup there. And then the military, they called that austere professor of Coimbra, professor of public finance, to put the accounts in order to fight the public debt, which he did, but through, of course, authoritarian means. So the problem of debt, public debt in Portugal was already chronic. After the revolution, as you said, twice Portugal had to ask the support of the IMF. And so when we had afterwards the problem with following Greece and Ireland, when I was Commission President, it was already some familiar music, some kind of intervention. And from that point of view, it was good lessons, because differently from others, namely from our Greek friends, Portugal decided to face the difficulties very courageously. And Portugal was very successful adopting the program of the European, so-called Troika, European Commission, European Central Bank, and IMF. And it was, in fact, implemented successfully, while our friends in Greece had to go through 3 programs that cost much more because of political hesitations, political difficulties. Portugal, there was, before that moment, a very, in my view, of course, it's my personal view, a very responsible government from the Socialist Party, led by Prime Minister Socrates, that created an extremely high debt that was not necessary. And so the markets, of course, started not believing in the capacity of Portugal to pay its debt. But afterwards, after the adjustment program, Portugal became, as you know now, Portugal is investment grade. But it was not like that during that period. So yes, I think some lessons from the revolutionary period were useful after when we need to make the adjustments in the 2000s, 2009 and 10, 11, 12.
I was, as you remember, a chief economist at Moody's in those days, and that was always my feeling, that comparing to the Greek case, the experiences that we had before from the period of adjustments immediately after the revolution made the government more capable of adjusting and more commitment to the adjustment than other cases during the euro area crisis. José Manuel, let's talk a little about the future. We know that the Portuguese people has made enormous advances since 1974. On a personal basis, we are a free, democratic, stable country. We live longer, healthier lives. We have the most educated generation in Portuguese history. Compared in terms of GDP per capita, our GDP now is 142% higher than what we had in 1974. But through the past 20 years, all these years of difficult crises, one after the other, we seem to somehow have stagnated in terms of our process of convergence, right? How can we perhaps recapture the dynamism and the hope that we had as a country in those years after the revolution, given the type of, let's put it this way, more restrained situation that we face nowadays?
Yeah, well, you are completely right. By the way, part of these difficulties are not only in Portugal. We are seeing that Europe is growing much less than the US or China from another system, okay, completely different system. So there are issues of growth and productivity or lack of productivity, lack of competitiveness in Europe, and Portugal, of course, being still, compared to our more advanced countries in Europe, still behind, has felt that particularly. Yes, that's true. It's true also the great progress. For instance, people don't know, Portugal, compared with the United States in social terms, Portugal has a longer life expectancy and has a lower child mortality. So it's amazing how the country transformed to mainly because of the European Union. It was the European Union, the fact that it came to a much more competitive and a much, let's say, more important political and economic system, and also direct support. Portugal, in fact, today it is difficult to think how Portugal was before 74. I remember I was a very young man, but I remember well the level of illiteracy, the extreme poverty in some parts of the country. Now there are still problems, social problems, but of a completely different nature. But the point for me, but that's of course a political statement, a matter of political judgment, is that there was not enough courage to make some of the necessary reforms. So the answer to your question is we need another kind of leadership, more courageous leadership, to invest more in the structural reforms that can bring Portugal forward. In fact, in the last years, we have lost that sense of convergence that was happening in some after we joined the European Union, but now it's no longer there because it's difficult for a government to ask for some kind of sacrifices, for some kind of let's say more rigor in some of the policies. And so I believe there are still many reforms that Portugal has to do during, by the way, the intervention of the European Union. They were done, but it was somehow a condition outside that was put outside, but not sufficiently. I believe it's possible. Portugal has a potential to grow. As you said, it's a very educated population now, but many, I now live between London and Lisbon. I mean, in London, I find so many brilliant young Portuguese people that, of course, are not staying in Portugal because what they can earn in Portugal is nothing comparable with what they can do in London or in the European Union or in Switzerland or in many other countries where they go now. So yes, it's possible, but that's an internal political question. Anyhow, the good news is that there is overall systemic political stability in Portugal. There are no issues about freedom and democracy and rule of law in Portugal. But I think, like you, that Portugal should do more to increase its competitiveness, to increase its growth potential, and that is possible provided there is an adequate leadership, political leadership.
Indeed. There is another dimension of this question about the future that I just posed to you, José Manuel, is the role of Portugal within the European family, let's put it this way, as a member of the European Union, but as also a member of the Atlantic Alliance. We are a transatlantic country by definition and the Dean of Geography, right? So, and this is an event in the Atlantic Council. So let's think perhaps in terms of the future role of Portugal within the broader Atlantic Alliance, and what can we expect given the type of possibilities and constraints that we face on these more contested global spaces that we have now?
Yeah, from the point of view, Portugal has been a very loyal member of the European Union and of the Atlantic Alliance. And there is a huge consensus. In fact, Portugal is one of the strongest. Among the 27 members of the European Union, it's one of the countries where there is the strongest consensus in favor. So we still have the communists, but they are a very small minority against, and a small party on the left, extreme left. But even our new, let's say, right-wing populist party that was now appearing recently, they are not against the European Union. They say they want some changes, but they are very strongly pro-NATO. So Portugal is a very Atlanticist country, also because of geography by nature. That, as you know, it's all, even before democracy, Portugal was already seeing itself as a bridge between Europe and the other part of the Atlantic, but not only our friends in the US, but also the traditional relationship with Brazil, very strong in the Portuguese, let's say, political culture. So from that point of view, and by the way, I think Portugal has been playing a very important role inside the European Union in all those, of course, has been punching above its weight, economic or demographic weight in the European Union, because I mean, I'm sorry to mention it, but I was the first president of the Commission coming from, not from the founding countries or from an important country like UK. I was the first to be coming from the so-called political periphery of Europe, precisely because Portugal is seen as a country that is at the center of the European Union politically and making consensus. And that's not by just a coincidence. So I believe Portugal will continue to do it, and so be supporting a European perspective, but also a transatlantic perspective. Let's hope that the United States will also be committed to this transatlantic relationship. Let's hope there will be no doubts anywhere in the world about the commitment of the United States, for instance, to our joint goals in Europe, namely supporting Ukraine and avoiding what will be a disaster, that will be a defeat of Ukraine, a victory for Mr. Putin, and that will be, I think, a catastrophe from not only for Europe, but for the way the world looks at Europe and looks at the United States.
That's a very true statement. Not only we should be committed to the transatlantic alliance, our other transatlantic partners should be committed to it equally. José Manuel, we are coming up to the end of this extremely interesting conversation. You are a historical figure for Portugal. I think that we are all part of this wonderful adventure that has been the half a century of democracy. I would like, if at all possible, finish this by saying Viva 25 de Abril, which is a sentiment that I think is shared by all of us. If you have a final sentence before I thank all the people that were fundamental on the organization of this, please, I think that we have 1 minute for this final reflection on this great national adventure that we all share.
I mean, for me, it was in the happiest day of my life, the 25th, from a public point of view, not speaking about my birth of my sons or something. It's an experience that we never forget. To see the crumbling of a dictatorship and a democracy coming. And when I had the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012, when the European Union received the Nobel Peace Prize, and I made this acceptance speech, I made the link peace with democracy. And it is, and in fact, I think that's important in the world that we are seeing now. Unfortunately, some non-democratic regimes are putting at risk the global peace, and that's one other reason why we should reinforce democracy all over the world. And I think the 25th of April can give some lessons for other parts of the world as well.
I can only second that. José Manuel, many, many thanks for this conversation. If I can dedicate 1 minute to thank all the team for this, your team at Goldman Sachs, your team at Gavi, the support was extraordinary. The members of our embassy in Washington, who told me they are listening to this, our ambassador Duarte Lopes and his deputy Alexandre Bilheiro, who provided impressive support through all this, and of course our counterparts at the Atlantic Council. Please continue following this conversation through all the channels that they disponibilize for that, and this recording will be available afterwards for people to continue watching this. José Manuel, meus agradecimentos pessoais e viva 25 de Abril.
Viva 25 de Abril e muito obrigado.
Meu grande prazer. And with this, we finish this event. Many thanks for attending. Thanks to all of you, and have a wonderful rest of the day.